Now, I know you're all really big Game of Thrones fans, so I'm sure you appreciate that story. After all of these sort of miracle stories and Jesus doing cool stuff and everything. And I know, we're still anxiously waiting for the last season of Game of Thrones. I know this probably just fits the bill. Nobody watches it, do you? Except me and Damien. Lori, Andrea. Okay. Do you at least know what I'm talking about, Game of Thrones? Okay, here's the thing. If you watch Game of Thrones, good on you. If you don't watch Game of Thrones but you're aware of it, you probably shouldn't watch it. And if you are not actually even aware of it, don't ever watch it. You shouldn't. It's kind of if you smush those together and then threw in a little bit of like the worst, most senseless things that you could think of that are violent and manipulative and conniving and dark, and it's like that. So it's just like this story. Right? This story is full of all of those great things that we love to watch on TV. It's full of, it's got violence, it's got manipulation, it's got plotting, it's got lust, doesn't it? Well, actually, that depends on who you ask, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But the bigger question is, why are we hearing this story? This is the Gospel of Mark. It's the gospel that begins, quite literally, it's the gospel that gives us the word gospel. I keep wanting to say Godspell, because that's what it gives us. The first line of the Gospel of Mark is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That is literally the first line. And it's where we get the word Godspell or gospel from, the good news, right? Because that's what it is. It's all good news, except this part. So why is this story in? This story, Mark is a gospel that is relentlessly, literally relentlessly, everything's about Jesus. The whole thing, there's no sidebar stories, except this one. It's all about Jesus. It focuses on Jesus. Even this piece of this story is introduced by, what are they calling Jesus? And yet we still have like 12 verses of story about somebody else. I know what you're thinking, because I was thinking this earlier in the week too. That makes perfect sense, though, because if you recall the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, right after it says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, it introduces John the Baptizer, who is the one who introduces Jesus. In fact, the first several verses, many verses, of the Gospel of Mark are about John the Baptist. He's quite possibly the only other character in the Gospel of Mark that actually gets any sort of backstory or any interesting facts. Or we don't really get to know anyone else except Jesus and John the Baptist. And now he's dead in chapter 6. It really is like Game of Thrones. Sean Bean could have played him. Anyway, that was an in-joke. Sorry about that. So maybe okay. We get this story about John the Baptist and the death of John the Baptist because we were introduced to him and we heard about him. He was the one to introduce Jesus. You could also think to yourself, actually, this does make perfect sense because not only were we introduced to John in an odd way, the senselessness of the death of John mirrors the senselessness of the death of Jesus. So maybe there are some connections there. But I'd still say, so there's a lot of other characters in the gospel story that still don't get the same treatment. And yet, here's this elaborate, for Mark, elaborate story. Mark's all about getting to the point, which ought to make you think there must be a point then to this story being included. And there is. And the point, I think, is hidden in the way it's introduced. So the reason John got arrested in the first place had nothing to do with the fact that he went around preaching and calling people to repentance. Didn't have anything to do with that. It didn't have anything to do with the fact that some of the things that he preached were kind of rebellious in the same way that the things Jesus preached were a little bit rebellious. Didn't have anything to do with that. What it had to do with, and this is not even Game of Thrones. This is like 25 years worth of watching a soap opera story. If you read the backstory of the Herodian family, oh my goodness. Everybody's related to everyone else. By the way, the daughter in this story, in all likelihood, actually Herodias was the niece of Herod, as well as being married to his brother. He divorced her, but he's still alive, which, by the way, if you look in Leviticus, he's still not supposed to marry her. And that's what John was complaining about. But if you read the backstory of the Herodian family through this era, it's, oh my goodness, mind-bogglingly horrible. They're all related to each other. So-and-so killed off his father or his brother or his sister's aunt's son. You know, it's that kind of a story. It's just incredible. And incredibly confusing because, as we discovered a little bit in this story, apparently everyone's name has to begin with Herod, like Herodias or Herod Antipas or Antipater or whichever one, Herod the Great was the father, right? Everybody's got a little bit of the Herod name in them there, and apparently a little bit of the Herod personality. And it's very complicated and complex. And what John was very loudly telling everyone was that Herod had violated the law by marrying his brother's wife. The fact that they were probably related is neither here nor there, but that was wrong. That made Herodias really annoyed, so much so that she wanted John dead. But Herod was scared of John a little bit. Herod was scared of John because he was a holy man. And you can hear a little bit of that in how John would preach, and Herod would like to hear what he has to say, though he didn't really understand it, but he thought it was really cool. Right? It's like a little bit like watching a magician and not knowing how he does the trick, right? You might get a little bit annoyed because you can't figure it out, but hey, it's still cool, you're going to watch that. So it's a little bit like that, except because he's a holy man, Herod quite literally fears him. So the best he can do to keep Herodias happy is to arrest him and throw him in jail. So he does. And then he has a big party. He invites a lot of the local people who are in charge of stuff. And I think that's the best way to say that, by the way, because you know he's not a king, right? Herod technically isn't a king. He's what was referred to in that century as a tetrarch, which when the Romans conquered places, they tend to divide it up. And a tetrarch means literally a person in charge of a quarter. And he was in charge of a quarter, literally, of what that area that the Romans had conquered. He had probably 2 quarters even. And that's not like farmland, sadly. It involved people and persecuting them and hurting them and stuff. But anyway, he's a tetrarch. He's not actually a king. And the only reason he's a tetrarch in the first place is because the Romans said he could. So the only reason that Herod has soldiers and lives in a palace and appears to be in charge of stuff is because the Romans said he could. It was useful to them. That's the only reason. There's also some question as to whether or not Herod, much like Pontius Pilate actually, who was not a really good governor, turns out, but Herod wasn't a good ruler. He called people in the middle of the sermon and things. He was not a good ruler, but he was also, the thing about all of that is that his power came from the fact that the Romans said he could have it. He didn't earn it. He wasn't the rightful anything. He got it because the Romans said he could have it. And what power he had, of course, was subservient to the Romans. And then, on top of all of that, he married his brother's wife. John starts talking about that. That annoys her. So he has this big event. And the daughter, whose name is either Salome or Herodias, the daughter of Herodias. However you know that version of the story, she dances for him. Now, if you've seen this, who's seen King of Kings, since we're on a visual thing here, okay, seriously, I get that you didn't watch Game of Thrones, but King of Kings, really? Wow, okay. You need to watch it on Netflix or something. No Netflix either, right? Okay. King of Kings is a classic. It's the life of Jesus from the epic era, right? Ben-Hur, anybody? 10 Commandments? Getting closer? Okay, awesome. King of Kings is from that era, and it's that style of epic movie making, right? And Jesus in King of Kings, famously, was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and really white, and played by Jeffrey Hunter, whose, come on, big test here, major claim to fame is... Wow. You guys need to watch more TV. He was the original Captain Pike on the original Star Trek TV show. Seriously, really? Yeah, in the original. That's right. The original captain of the Enterprise was Jesus. That's right. So, Star Trek is powerful. I'm just saying. Anyway, in King of Kings, this scene is portrayed in a particularly dramatic, Game of Thrones-ish kind of fashion. Geoffrey Thring plays Herod, and he's awesome. Like, he literally drools. Like, literally. And Salome's a really attractive, dressed in a skimpy outfit. She does the dance with the veils and stuff and throwing things. It's very dramatic. And clearly he is lusting after her, and she's teasing him and leading him on. And then eventually she gets to ask for this thing. And when you watch it, you kind of think to yourself, yeah, she's enjoying that. She's enjoying being able to control him and get what she wants, even if it's not actually what she wants, but what her mother wants. She's enjoying that. The thing is, that's not in the story. It doesn't say that. It just says that he wanted her to dance. It also, by the way, the literal translation that describes her character in this story is little girl. She might have been like 14 or 15, if that. And there's nothing that would indicate there's anything untoward about any of this, just that he wanted her to dance. And so she does. And because she's a kid, she doesn't know what to ask for. And in fact, you can't really assume that she's manipulating him or controlling him in any way other than just being a kid. And she needs to ask her mom what to ask for. In fact, if you want a victim in this story, really, she's kind of a victim in this story too. Or she has all sorts of power here. Because she not only gets to make Herod do what she wants, she gets to draw that out of her mother and play both of them at the same time. Which is it? Don't know. But think about that, because there's options here. One thing there isn't really an option about is that clearly Herodias wanted John dead. Why she quite specifically needed his head chopped off, and why Salome quite specifically needed to ask for that to come on a platter, I don't really know, but she clearly wanted him dead, and now is her moment, and she gets it. She gets what she wants. And John's dead. In fact, as the story ends, the disciples come to collect him. Jesus doesn't. Jesus doesn't go. The disciples go to go and get him. So why is the story here? It's about power, right? It's about power. Who has the power in this story? It's not the guy who has the soldiers, who, by the way, only has them because the Romans say he can. It's Herodias. It's the wife who has the power here. Isn't it? Because she gets what she wants. Whether or not that power has really satisfied her need, it might be a different question. We don't know. We do know that Herod goes on to be just a terrible ruler and ends up actually being banished somewhere, and dying in exile and things. So it doesn't work out well for him. But who has the power in this story? And what kind of power is it? Because it has nothing to do with force. It has nothing to do with armies. It has nothing to do with money, even. None of the things that we usually associate with power are working in this story. Herod has power because the Romans say he can, and it's literally force. That's the only kind of power he has. John has some power in this story. He has some power in this story because Herod's afraid of him, because he's a holy man. It's not enough power as it happens, but he has some. Salome has some power in this story because she gets to get what she wants. She doesn't really know what it is. So what kind of power is that? What kind of power is that? She gets what she wants, but she doesn't really know what it is, so she has to ask somebody else. So she's not really getting what she wants. She's getting what her mother wants. What kind of power is that? And Herodias gets what she wants. She gets John dead, which seems to be what she wants, but is that ever going to satisfy her? As it happens, as powerful as that might seem in this moment, thousands of years later, we still talk about John the Baptist as a key figure in the story of Jesus. And not a whole lot of people remember Herodias, other than as part of this story. When Herod and Herodias and all the Herodians are long forgotten, we still talk about John the Baptist. What kind of power is all that? Because that's what the story is about. That's why it's introduced as, what are they calling Jesus? Well, maybe John the Baptist, alive again. Maybe Elijah, alive again. Maybe a prophet like the prophets of the Old Testament, alive again. Or is it something new? Remember in this, Mark is actually one of the Gospels that doesn't have a birth story of Jesus. It literally starts in on Jesus preaching and teaching and doing miracles and stuff. But the stories we hear about Jesus, from the birth stories of the other Gospels, throughout all of the Gospels, the stories we always hear make it clear that Jesus was not the Messiah that they expected. The Messiah they expected was going to be a great king, probably like David, was going to have a great army and great wealth, and with that great army was going to throw off the oppressor Rome and restore the glory of Israel with great power. And that great power was invested in having great soldiers, being a great leader, all of those traditional ways that we see power. Probably should have been wealthy too. But that's not what they got. Jesus is very different. A very different kind of Messiah, because Jesus is about challenging a very different kind of power. Jesus doesn't challenge the kind of power that involves armies and soldiers. It doesn't challenge the kind of power that involves you having more money than me. Actually, it probably does. But what he's most interested in is a kind of power that comes in relationships. And the difference between having power over people and having power with people. Jesus is all about having power with people. Jesus healing people is stories about Jesus restoring people to their place with others, restoring their relationship with others. When Jesus speaks out against power, it's this kind of power he speaks against. When John spoke out about power, it was this kind of power he spoke against. He didn't speak out against Herod marrying his brother's wife because he didn't like her or him, or he didn't care for the palace they lived in or anything like that. He spoke out against it because it was wrong according to the law. And a leader should follow the lesson of the law, right? If not the letter of it, the intent of it. So did Jesus. The kind of power that Jesus addressed had nothing to do with force and might, the way we traditionally see it. It had to do with how we have power in a relationship. And Jesus teaches us to share that power and have power with people. That's what love and care and compassion and grace do. And this story is about the exact opposite of that. This story is about how senseless the exact opposite of that is. For as much as anybody in this story had different kinds of power, it gained them nothing in the end. The death of John did not satisfy anything for them. It was literally senseless. That's the kind of power that Jesus speaks to. It's a reminder to us that we need to speak to that kind of power as well. And not just to remind people about love and care and compassion, but to speak out when that kind of power happens. To not just stand by and let it happen, but to say something. As Jesus goes on in his preaching and his teaching, he will continue to speak out against that. He will continue to challenge the Pharisees. He will continue to challenge the leaders of the community. He will continue to challenge us to build relationships based on sharing the power that we have and ensuring that everyone has it and uses it together. The power of relationship, of love and grace and compassion, of truth. That's the point of the story. That's the point of it being here. In this moment after Jesus comes back he goes out into the community, his home community, and then he goes back on the road. He sends the disciples out, and they do amazing things, and they come back. Herod hears of this. And how does Herod understand it? He's afraid of Jesus too, because he thinks he's John the Baptist. Another holy man speaking truth to his power. Afraid of him, and yet he can't do anything yet. Jesus calls us to that same role of speaking truth to power, of standing up for each other, of building relationships with each other, not just encouraging each other to be graceful and compassionate and loving, but to speak out when we see that it's not happening. That's what Jesus calls us to. That's what the story calls us to.